Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello everyone, welcome to Healing the Spirit. Today I'm going to be sharing some reflections, contemplations, and meditations on Mercury. So if you are watching the astrology, you may know that today is the Mercury Cazimi. That is a moment where Mercury meets the Sun, and it's happening within a period of what we call Mercury Retrograde. So let's first talk a little bit about Mercury's trajectory during the specific retrograde period. So Mercury stationed retrograde on August 5th, 2024 at 4 degrees Virgo. Fun fact, that is literally my ascendant or my rising degree. So this specific Mercury retrograde feels very personal to me. I have been in deep ongoing relationship and conversation with Mercury for a long time, since I basically started studying astrology, because I'm a Virgo rising and Mercury is my ascendant ruler. But yeah, this specific one feels really illuminating. There are so many ways in which Mercury is showing me all the ways that I do Virgo things in my life that I maybe have not always been so conscious of, or that haven't always been very clear to me. So that aside, let's go back to Mercury's trajectory. What I think is interesting about the specific retrograde period is, as Mercury stationed retrograde, Mars was in 10 degrees Gemini and Venus was in 0 degrees Virgo. So literally Venus just entered Virgo, right, when Mercury went retrograde. So both Gemini and Virgo are Mercury's domains. So Mercury is essentially stewarding the movements and trajectories of Mars and Venus throughout the specific retrograde period. So not only are we getting some of the themes that we associate with Mercury retrograde, right, which has to do with reflecting on our thought patterns, reflecting maybe on our beliefs, reflecting on the ways that we use our cognitive faculties in our day-to-day reality, in terms of how we allocate our energies, in terms of how our emotions are impacted by our thoughts, in terms of how we walk our spiritual path, right? By involving, or maybe unconsciously not involving, our cognitive mind, you know? And some of these themes are also, I would say, reflected in the journeys of Mars and Venus, right? And so how we can maybe interpret that right off the bat is that this specific Mercury retrograde is already quite visceral, or maybe felt on a deep body level, because it's happening in the earth sign of Virgo. But then add to that the layers of Mercury while retrograde being responsible for stewarding the movements of Mars and Venus, brings an added layer of viscerality, brings an added layer of body sensations, right? Mars and Venus both rule things that are really connected to our body, that are really connected to our lived experiences and our visceral experiences, right? Mars relates to desires, to willpower, to our ability to navigate conflict, and Venus has to do with our ability to harmonize and our ability to attract, right? And it's also really interesting to note that Mars is going to stay in Gemini and Venus is going to stay in Virgo, even all the way until Mercury stations direct on August 28th. So As I mentioned earlier, today is where Mercury goes Cazimi, or Mercury meets up with the sun, right, at 26 degrees Leo. And then Mercury continues moving backwards in the degrees of Leo until August 28th at 21st degree Leo, where it will start stationing direct. And Mercury will re-enter Virgo, which is its place of exaltation and domicile, on September 9, 2024. It's also worth noting that this is going to be the last Mercury retrograde in Virgo for some time, because after this, Mercury will start going retrograde in fire signs. Okay, so let's talk more about the significations of Mercury and what we might be able to glean from this. So Mercury, as the messenger, as the psychopomp, as the court jester, can teach us a lot about the power and the efficacy of mobility, flexibility, and agility, right? Mercury teaches us that it's not always about building an empire. Empires are heavy, clunky, and they can be impossible to transport, right? Instead, Mercury teaches us to learn how to build a tent. Tents can move with us, right? Tents are flexible. Tents are inherently unstable, so they can constantly move with the changing tides of reality. Mercury can teach us about how to not hoard resources. Hoarding resources may give us a psychological sense of safety, but it ultimately can keep us stuck as well. Mercury is rather more interested in creating survival kits. Mercury is more interested in teaching us how to learn skills and ways of thinking and being that are applicable, that are transferable to many different situations. Mercury says, rather than you spending all of your time learning how to be an expert at something, maybe you can learn a lot of different things, right? And in learning a lot of different things, perhaps you'll start to see the connection between all these different things, and you'll be able to apply those connecting threads to many different situations, right? So that you're not just forced or limited to being able to thrive in very specific circumstances. Mercury also can teach us about the importance of not trying too hard to fit into one culture. It is very human to want safety and belonging, right? However, safety and belonging within just one cultural framework can ultimately be too feeble, too easily tossed around by the whims of certain groups of people. This is something that we do know, right? That culture shifts and changes more than we would like it to, or more than we care to admit. One way that I like to think about this is look at each decade in the 20th century. There have been so many changes from one decade to another in terms of how people dress, how people eat, how people spend their time, what's important for people, the kind of music they listen to, the kind of art that they make, right? And instead, if you can learn the languages and the ways of many different people, and you can learn how to ask the right questions, how to carry yourself in different situations, you'll not only find safety in many different places, but you'll also be able to make a home wherever you go. You'll be able to make friends wherever you go. You'll find that you actually increase your likelihood of survival, and you'll increase your ability to thrive when you know how to speak to people's hearts and people's desires and people's needs in ways that transcend their cultural norms of what's acceptable and what's not at any given moment. So Mercury retrograde gives us an opportunity to look at how we are. How far along are we with learning the lessons of mobility, flexibility, and agility. And what I'm thinking about with regards to these qualities is how they require us to not be stuck or not be too attached or invested in any one state of being. Whether we like it or not, we as humans are always trying to find that safety, right? Trying to find that feeling of like, oh yes, I can just relax here. And I like to think of this in terms of surfing, actually, as opposed to driving. When we're driving a car, depending on where you drive, obviously, but generally speaking, if you are living as a modern person, you're probably driving through a road that's pretty smooth, right? That's paved, and there's not a lot of bumpiness along the way. Whereas when you're surfing, you have to constantly balance. Surfing is a very active thing, right? Surfing requires you to kind of be with the ups and downs of the waves. And so Mercury retrograde is also sometimes can feel a little bit rocky or sometimes can be a little glitchy, but in that glitch gives us an opportunity to really reflect on like, how are we when life doesn't go the way that we want it to go? What happens to our nervous system, to our emotional body when things don't go exactly as we planned? And this might be the moment where you expect me to say, surrender, go with the flow, right? As many other, I don't know, spiritually interested person would probably say, or maybe I'll say something like, meditate, right? And that's not where I'm going with this. That's not where I'm going with this. That's not where Mercury is taking me during this specific retrograde. Instead, what I would like us to root into, to at least consider, is the idea of thinking with the heart and feeling with the mind. Something that I've noticed in a lot of different spiritual teachings or in a lot of different spiritual circles is kind of this I call it the artificial division between the mind, the body, the heart, and the spirit. There is a tendency to see one of them as better or more spiritual than the other. And what I would like us to consider is that perhaps this is the time for us to stop bedeviling our thinking mind, to stop treating our thinking mind as the enemy, and to begin embracing it as a collaborator in the dance. That perhaps these different faculties of our being, right, of our system, are really kind of interconnected and interdependent with one another, and that they're inextricably linked, that they're not really something we can push aside or pull apart or kind of punish the mind and be like, stop thinking, right? Which can sometimes maybe not be the way that we not the way that we are taught necessarily by a lot of these spiritual teachings, but it's kind of the hidden message behind it, you know? My mentor, Diana Rose Harper, said something once that has really stuck with me ever since. She said something along the lines of how thinking happens in the brain, and the brain is in the body. And to consider thinking as antithetical or separate from embodiment is perhaps a misguided concept. So where I want to deepen into with this particular line of consideration that I would like us to kind of sit with together, right, is that consider that not all thinking is created equal. thinking can be regenerative, thinking can be soul-sucking, just like basically everything else in life, right? Eating can be regenerative, eating can be soul-sucking. Cleaning can be regenerative, cleaning can be soul-sucking. Sleeping can be regenerative, or sleeping can be detrimental, right? And so why is thinking not the same, right? And I understand where this is coming from, because a lot of us, especially if we operate within the framework of the Western world, we operate within the modernist framework, within cultures where the scientific materialist worldview is really, really strong, right? Where colonialism has pervaded into all aspects of our lives, it makes sense that we want to fight our brains, right? That we want to fight our thinking mind, because perhaps some of the thinking patterns that have been taught to us and that have been sold to us as the quote unquote reality have not served us, and they've been soul sucking, right? And we've been led to think in a way that doesn't acknowledge the reality of our heart and our bodies and our spirits, right? But that doesn't mean necessarily that thinking itself is wrong. The act of thinking can be equally generative as the act of feeling our bodies, right? The timing, the intensity, the content, and the context of our thinking really matters, because thinking, like everything else, can be used as a tool that helps liberate us, or thinking can be used as a tool to oppress us, right? Like anything else. So perhaps the first step is not so much controlling our thoughts or getting to a no-think state, which is a sentiment that I think is a little bit over-popularized in our culture, and especially within spiritual circles, in my opinion. And like anything that has become too popular and used too much, it's also become problematic because it's widespread, but it's also misinterpreted or misused, right? Or sometimes coming from a place that doesn't honor certain parts of our living experience. And when something doesn't honor a segment of our living experience, it can ultimately be oppressive. It can ultimately be toxic to us, right? So perhaps the first step is not really to, as I mentioned, getting rid of our thoughts, right? This is something I hear a lot when I teach meditation, that people are like, but I can't stop my thinking. And I'm like, why did you think you need to stop your thinking in the first place? Who taught you that you need to stop your thinking, right? But perhaps the first step is to become more aware of what makes up our thoughts, and then to begin creating some space, right, between our identity and our thoughts, and really asking the questions: why do we think what we think? What is the origin of this thought? Who taught us to think like this, right? Was it an authority figure? Was it the environment we grew up in? Was it the environment we currently find ourselves in? And just start playing around with that a little bit, right? And feel into how our bodies respond to different thoughts. Do our thoughts, as they currently bubble up or present themselves to us, do they represent what feels true to us? Or do these thoughts and thought patterns reflect back to us the prevalent ideas floating around in the ether? Something that's come up over and over in the container I'm currently facilitating, Deep Spirit Medicine, is this idea of, is this mine or is this someone else's, right? This is a question that one of my teachers, Deborah Kremens, always encourage us to ask. And I think it's an incredible question, because a lot of the times our thoughts, our feelings, especially when they're unexamined, are conglomerations or combinations of a lot of different thoughts that are not always for us to really figure out, and as we get more specific, as we ask ourselves more detailed questions about some of these beliefs, some of these thought patterns, a lot of them actually falls apart, right? And I think this is where Mercury, this is the ecosystem, or this is the landscape, this is the areas of life where Mercury can really help us, right? We can ask Mercury to help us ask better questions for ourselves. When any certain thoughts come up, we can create healthy distance with that thought and give ourselves the opportunity to ask if that thought feels relevant to this moment, if that thought feels like it's really for us to think about, or maybe we can simply let it go. Another thing to consider is how our thoughts are often shaped by the containers we find ourselves in. So what I mean by that is that our world really designs our thinking. We will do well to start considering, what containers am I in? What culture am I surrounded by? What do people around me think? How do people around me think? And as we start noticing the world around us, we might start making connections of how the world around us impacts our thoughts. For example, I'm going to give you a very simple example, which is our posture, right? Our posture is actually a container. So you might find that if you are lying down, you will instantly start thinking slightly different thoughts versus when you're standing up or sitting up, right? I noticed that, for example, if I'm journaling, right, sitting up with my back straight, right, on a chair, I will have a very specific kind of thinking. But if I start lying down on my belly to the floor, right, I'll start thinking slightly differently. In my case, what I've noticed is this was something I used to do as a child. I used to lie on the floor, my belly would be on the floor, and then I would have my colored pencils and I would start drawing. I would just start drawing freely and kind of just making lines and playing with different colors. And there's a kind of playfulness that I can access when I'm lying belly flat on the ground, which is very different than like when I'm trying to journal, for example, sitting down, because my body and my brain have associated sitting down on a chair as being work time, right? Or I'm in work mode, or I'm in study mode. So you might find, you might want to try this. You might want to try lying down on the sofa and seeing if your thought patterns start shifting. It's also reminding me of something that I've heard a lot of different people say over the years, which is, for example, I once had a friend who had a sleeping problem, and their solution to it was actually pretty wild. And I'm not advocating this will work for everybody, obviously, but this is just to illustrate a point, right? Which is that they started putting these glow-in-the-dark stickers on top of their ceiling, on their ceiling, right? And it shifted their relationship to sleeping, because the moment that they started lying down on their bed, they started to just be so relaxed and really delighted by what they're seeing on their ceiling. And it shifted their thought patterns and it shifted their sleeping experience, right? Another way to think about containers impacting the the way we think is think about when you have a really busy day. When you have a really busy day and you have meetings back to back, or you have activities, you need to run around town, you probably are not able to, or you don't have the capacity to have certain kinds of conversations with loved ones. Whereas when you have a little bit more spaciousness, perhaps you do, right? So our thinking mind is so influenced by everything else. Our thinking mind is in a dance with our bodies, our hearts, our spirits, right? And rather than treating the thinking mind as this thing that we need to lobotomize or that we need to get out of, perhaps we can think of it as a dance. And if the thinking mind is really busy or really stressed out, maybe we can get more curious about it, and we can be like, oh, this is interesting. Maybe I can treat this as an alarm clock a little bit. Maybe in investigating my thinking mind and my thinking patterns and noticing what thoughts I am thinking, I can feel into the different ways that my body needs nourishment, that my heart needs tending, that my spirit needs meditating maybe, or simply needs me to say hello to it, right? To re-access our connection to our own spirit. So some experiences are primarily felt, right? And I think what I'm trying to get at with this idea that certain experiences are primarily felt is that there's a bit of a paradox here, which is the experience of right thinking is a felt sensation. It's almost like what I've noticed for myself is when I get myself into the right pattern of thinking, meaning the pattern of thinking that can actually nourish me, that can actually relax me enough so that I can more deeply be with what is in front of me right now. What happens is that it's almost like something clicks, and then there's like the symphony is being played in the right rhythm and in the right key, right? The experience of right thinking, in my experience, and in my own personal felt being, is kind of like something clicked, and then the body and the nervous system and the heart and the spirit starts to kind of be in concert with one another. They start to be in step, and they start to do this really beautiful dance. There are experiences that can sometimes be associated with concepts that are helpful to name and put into words, but no amount of words can really make them make sense unless the experience has been felt in the body and identified with the brain, right? So I think this is important to illustrate the reality that our body and our brains and our hearts and our spirits are always kind of interlocked with one another, right? I think usually, at least in my own experience, this can be kind of boiled down into two components. One is the body needs to feel the sensations, and then there needs to be a recognition by the mind of, oh, that's how it felt, right? Because sometimes our bodies stumble upon experiences, but then the mind isn't fully aware that this experience is happening, and it doesn't fully capture it. And it doesn't mean that we can't kind of come back to it, but I think that moment of alignment actually happens when the body and the mind kind of works together, and they're able to see one another, similar to how the sun and the moon are able to kind of reflect one another's light, right? So let me give an example from my own personal life. As someone who was primarily trained to be a performer until I was about 23, I know how to be on stage. I mean, I know how to be on stage, right? As in, I've practiced throughout my life to understand that there's this process that one needs to take oneself through in order to get to a point where one can deliver a material in a certain way in front of an audience, right? I've learned throughout my years training in classical piano to work with my fear, to work with my nervousness of showing up and delivering a material to an audience, right? And the experience of being able to do this is very much transferable. I noticed that in learning how to perform, I become better at speaking in front of an audience. I become better at singing, even though I wasn't necessarily an incredible singer before I started training my voice. And yet I knew how to be in front of an audience, right? I also know how much preparation is needed until I get to that state, right? What people don't often realize if they don't have performing arts background is that there is a tremendous amount of feedback that is necessary in order to get to a point where performance is aligned. And it's not enough to just get the feedback, right? But it's necessary to metabolize the feedback so that you can kind of have the performance embodied in a way that aligns with what your brain wants it to be. So this is specifically something that I can really feel with music. So usually it begins with a certain ideal in my mind. There's a certain ideal of, I want the song to sound like this, right? And then I start practicing it. And then in my internal experience, things start to gel together. And I start to like how I sound, or how I imagine I sound as I'm kind of practicing, right? But then once I start recording myself, or I start performing in front of friends and family, inevitably I will start seeing the cracks. There's always something to fine tune, right? And usually I need to go back to the practice room and I need to figure out how to get myself mentally, emotionally, physically to a place where I can listen to my performance and be like, that's it, right? So there's this iterative process to not just perform, but be able to communicate, right? Because ultimately, performance is a two-way street. It's not just about what I feel and what I know inside, but it's also about how I can deliver that internal experience and radiate it outwards, right? Radiate it externally to a group of people who are existing outside of my body. Okay, so fast forward to this specific chapter of my life right now where I'm facilitating and I'm teaching and I'm working with people one-on-one in readings. In some ways, what I've noticed is that all of those experiences with performing transfers. I know how to share materials in front of people in a way that is compelling, interesting, and perhaps even impressive sometimes, right? Chances are, if you're listening to me talk about Mercury up until this point, you agree on some level, right? You're like, oh, Jonathan's somewhat interesting. But what I'm currently realizing is that there is another dimension to teaching and facilitating that goes beyond impressing the audience. The impressiveness of how I deliver certain materials may be how I grab people's attention. But in order for me to really let that land, I need to take it a step further, right? And this was something that I've been trying to figure out, or that I've been trying to feel into for some time. Like, where is that gap, right, between people kind of being blown away by something that I said versus people actually receiving that, letting that land, and allowing it to transform something within them, right? I think there's a shift that actually needed to happen from the orientation of performing, which is let me practice this piece of music, or maybe let me practice this material I'm about to share with you so that I can blow you away and make you speechless for the next however many minutes this showcase lasts, right? Into the orientation of actually facilitating an understanding and a knowing to start weaving in for the other person, which is more like, let me share a piece of information or a question to get your whole system to start orienting, to start thinking, and start feeling in a certain direction. And then let me help you consider that same piece of information from different angles that I can explore. And also, let me attune to your being, as in your human body language, your state of being, your state of presence, so that I can calibrate my delivery. So I can go a little bit slower, or I can go a little faster, or I can deepen into a concept, or I can backtrack so that you can kind of feel into how this might be relevant for you, you know? And the two are totally different, right? And the reality is, now that I'm kind of beginning to find myself on the other side of this, of really learning where's that line for me between performing and actually facilitating or actually teaching, I can theorize about this all day long, right? I have so many words I can say about this. But what I realized in facilitating this container that I'm currently teaching, Deep Spirit Medicine, is that most of this is actually a felt sense. In fact, maybe all of it is a felt sense, right? And a teacher or a mentor can talk me through the sequence, right, of learning how to bring a concept and then explore it from many different angles so that people can more deeply root into it, until foam comes out of their mouth. But if I've never felt in my body and then also not just feel in my body, but register in my mind that sensation of things actually clicking, not only for me, but for this group that I'm currently speaking to, it would never make sense to me. The difference between impressing people and facilitating them in their process is huge on a felt sense. Like, it's something I can actually feel in my body, but it feels really complicated and unclear, and maybe not even that different on a mental level. You know, on a mental level, it can seem like, oh, just say a few more words or throw in a few more examples, right? But it's actually not. It's actually kind of a felt sense because you have to kind of modulate in real time. So why am I bringing this in the context of thinking, right? Because in some ways, what I've noticed is that I needed for some people or some mentors to kind of talk me through this sequence, even though it didn't totally make sense to me. I needed that, right? But then the reason why I needed that is because it then gives my body the cue to be able to feel into when that's happening, right? So similarly, I think this is what's happening, for example, with this podcast, right? When we talk about specific transits, the reason why that can be so powerful is because it prepares us on a mental level to be able to then notice when the experiences are happening in our bodies, right? So that's a very long-winded way of saying that if we lobotomize our brains, if we say no thinking, right? If you want to be a spiritual being, no thinking, then you can't really register that experience on a felt sense. Because in some ways, if our bodies have not been trained yet to feel what that experience feels like, then the only way to get there is really to entrain the mind first, because the mind is in some ways, I believe, a little bit more flexible than the body, right? The body has its own ways. The body moves in mysterious ways. We call it the animal body for a reason. But when the mind is brought into it, then there's a chance for the body to catch up afterwards. Then there's a chance for the heart to open up afterwards, right? So I invite you to feel into this for yourself. Where is there a divide between your conceptual understanding and your felt lived experience? Where are you noticing that perhaps your mind thinks that, oh, this relationship should be great, right? Or this job should be terrible. But actually, like maybe the relationship doesn't actually work. Or maybe the job actually does work, right? I may have mentioned this on the podcast, but this is something that I have experienced for years. I had this experience of thinking in my brain that I'm not really supposed to be holding this day job for very long. But then I'm kind of 8 years into a current day job. And if I really feel into my body, I'm like, no, this is good. I actually love having this dual existence of my day job and then also doing this deep spirit soul work for myself and for other people. And I also invite you to feel into what can be the role of your mind, what can be the role of your cognitive awareness in bridging that divide, right? Meaning, as you become aware of the divide in your mind, can you start noticing your energy shifting? Is there a shift in your energy? Perhaps you start noticing that you start to relate to the divide differently. As you become aware of the divide, maybe you start relaxing a little bit. Sometimes this is something that I notice a lot when I'm doing readings, that sometimes I would be talking about a specific placement that I see in the chart, and I could sense the body of the person in front of me starting to relax, because in talking about this dynamic that I see in their chart, it gives their mind a permission to not be so hard on themselves, that maybe what they're experiencing right now is exactly what they're supposed to be experiencing, and then the body relaxes, right? So the mind kind of becomes this gateway into the body sometimes. Or perhaps you start to see situations from a different vantage point, that maybe you start to see, oh, I can look at the situation this way or this way, right? Or maybe you become aware of a sense of space in your body, a sense of relaxation that becomes available through the mental noticing. Can you notice if there's a difference between engaging your mind in order to avoid suffering or to anticipate issues, right? To troubleshoot ahead of time, right? Or to make up stories, versus engaging your mind to critically engage with the situation, assess the situation, so ultimately you can relax into and uncover deeper layers of wisdom that are already within your body, already within your heart, already within your spirit, right? So, where I want us to land with regards to contemplating this specific Mercury retrograde in Virgo and in Leo is that perhaps there is a connection between the heart and the mind that are much more readily available than we've been led to believe. That perhaps consider that the heart and the mind are not separate, but they are distinct, right? Loosely speaking, they're not only associated with different areas or regions in our somatic experiences, but they also feel different. For me, the experience of my mind making sense of something and my heart picking up an information is very different, right? I think that the reason why I don't really prescribe to the idea that the mind needs to turn off in order for us to really feel into our heart's desires or our heart's truth or our heart's experiences is because it's not been true for me, number one. And number two, I really question the efficacy and the pragmatism of this, right? I do think that they are interweaving constantly. The mind and the heart are like the earth and the sky, right? They are distinct, but they also communicate constantly. And in the best of days, they are in sync. There's this harmony. There's this deep marriage between the two. There is no earth without sky, right? There's no sky without earth. And so I think there's something about really questioning how much of this idea of turning off the brain in order for the heart or the spirit to come online is rooted in some puritanical beliefs or rooted in either or binary thinking, right? We can sit here all day trying to parse out this belief on a philosophical level, but ultimately, I'm a total pragmatist. My real beef with spiritual teachings that espouse leaving the mind in order to access some other kind of state is not philosophical. It's really practical. As in, I, Jonathan, have never been super excited to do this. I live the kind of life where after I meditate, I would be writing a podcast episode, which requires my mind, right? Or maybe I go to my day job, which also requires my mind. Or I, navigate the subway system in New York City, which also requires my mind. I don't want to miss my stop, right? So if I have to leave my mind to also access my heart and my intuition, that to me is not a very exciting proposition because it's just not really practical and it's not very useful for my life. Like, how am I going to make it through the maze of Trader Joe's aisles and also find my frozen kimbap if I don't use my mind? And at the same time, I want to access spiritual and heart-led, heart-opening experiences everywhere. I don't want my spiritual ecstatic experiences to only happen when I'm meditating or when I'm out on a retreat, or when I'm praying, when I'm on the yoga mat. I want to have a spiritual experience while I'm ordering a $1 slice pizza in Bushwick. I want to have a spiritual experience while I'm cleaning my toilet. I want to have a spiritual experience while I'm doing my taxes, I believe that we can really have both because we are given the mind and we are given the hearts, right? So if they're all here for us, maybe let's try to use it. Let's try to figure out if there's a way to weave them together in ways that are exciting, right? And Mercury's retrograde going from Virgo, right, the realm of the mind, of the analytical, of the intellect, into Leo, the realm of the heart, the creative divine soul, the fixed fire of our expansive self, and then back to Virgo, is such an opportunity to stitch these experiences together, right? Can we give our minds a chance to help the body drop into the wisdom of the heart and the spirit? Can we give the intelligence of the heart and the spirit to create pathways so that the mind can catch inspiration with ease, so the mind can make sense of what the heart and the spirit are experiencing in ways that are life-giving, in ways that we can share with each other. There's so much richness when we engage both. There's so much energy that becomes available to us when we stop making one wrong and the other one right. There's so much creative possibilities that open up when we love and embrace our minds and also love and embrace our hearts. All right, that's it from me by way of contemplations. I hope that this episode has served you. I hope that it's given you much to consider, and I hope that in some ways it's helped you rewire a lot of the ways that you relate to your mind and to begin at least considering the possibility that your mind can be the most beautiful and portal opening ally to your spiritual experiences. If any of you would like to work with me one-on-one, I would love to do that. I have some space in my calendar in September. And yeah, I look forward to connecting with those of you who would like to receive an astrology reading or divination reading or do some energy work with me. All right. Thank you so much. I hope you have a beautiful week, and I'll catch you again very soon. Sending you lots of love, and thank you for listening.